All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Reagan. I'm with Period at Auburn, Alabama. Slowly, everyone is trickling in from the waiting room. So I'm going to give us a few minutes before we fully start with the questions. But in the interim, it would be awesome if every panelist could go around and introduce themselves and explain their role and their title.
I guess I'll go first. So my name is Faith Nongchef. I'm with Rape Counselors of East Alabama. I am a co-facilitator with Reagan. At Rape Counselors, I serve as the victim advocate and outreach coordinator.
I'm Amanda Carpenter, and I'm also work with Faith at Rape Counselors of East Alabama, and I am the victim advocate and outreach specialist.
I'm Emily Ratkoviak. I'm a student here at Auburn University in the Auburn chapter of Period. Specifically, my role is on the education committee, and I'm studying microbiology with minors in public health and business.
Well, hi, I'm Alex Cheeves. I am a sex columnist for The Advocate magazine. I write sex content for Out magazine and Them and a few other LGBT-focused media outlets, and I answer sex questions on my blog. And that's me. So, hi.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. I'm Dr. Mildred Watson. I'm a healthy relationship therapist and a clinical sexologist. I work privately, and I also contract with Impact Family Counseling, which we have 2 locations in Birmingham, Alabama.
My name is Courtney Furlong, and I have worked with victims of sex trafficking for the past 15 years. I'm a rehabilitation counselor, but I'm currently working on my PhD at Auburn in human development and family science. And my current research area is looking at how sexual assault impacts one's sense of control.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really excited for this discussion. You guys are wonderful, and looking forward to the next hour. So we're going to go ahead and get started with some of our questions and just a few announcements for anyone that's watching. If you don't mind muting yourself, and if you have any questions, you can privately message either Faith or myself, and we can relay those to everyone else that's on the panel. And with that being said, we'll get started. So the first question is, how do you teach about sex and sexual health as well as menstrual health in your specific position? So whoever wants to take it away.
So here at Rape Counselors of East Alabama, we do a lot of different things. We put out cards, we go to certain events, and our main focus is talking about like what you would do if you were ever sexually assaulted and how that looks like. If that was to happen to you, what you would do. You had 72 hours, on the state of Alabama to go to the hospital, have a Jane Doe kit done. Don't they, just the things that you would do if you were ever sexually assaulted. We also have other people on our staff that go out in the community and do prevention education, where they talk about Aaron's Law, safe dating, healthy relationships. And that's kind of how we go out in the community and teach about those different things.
With the education community for Period, I essentially gather information on a wide variety of topics that umbrella under sex health and menstrual health, from different menstrual issues some females and menstruators may experience. And so with all that information, I make social media posts, posters, pamphlets that can be spread around campus and around to other areas in our community, to help further the education on those topics.
I get a lot of referrals. I do a lot of one-on-ones. Also, I do a lot of groups because I have a nonprofit organization, Hope for My Sisters. I founded that organization back in 2012. I am an overcomer of sexual abuse myself, and so I partner with other organizations, and I get a lot of women who are going through addictions and different things like that. And so individual and group, and we teach about healthy sex education, signs to look for, just a variety of things. But most of the people come to me through referrals and through groups that we do. We partner with several organizations that are women organizations. Do a lot of things with reentry too. A lot of women that's coming out of incarceration trying to be reacclimated back into society. So it's just a whole gamut of things, but just ministering to the need basically is what we do.
Well, I don't know if this necessarily applies. The vast majority of questions that I get are from teenage-aged queer people. I would say the vast majority are probably cisgender, but I do get some trans and non-binary questions, particularly about sex, and a shocking percentage of them have experienced some kind of sexual assault, and so it's at least I personally struggle sometimes with being able to bring sex positive advice and competent sex advice to people who associate a very strong degree of trauma with sexuality. So in my own writing and my own work, a repeated theme that I find myself tackling is, what does sex positivity look like in a culture where abuse is so prevalent? And I think that's a really vital discussion to have. So.
Did everyone on the panel, or did y'all all get your answers in? Feel good?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So just in regards to like each of your respective fields, why do you think it's important to have proper sex education?
Well, at Rape Counselors of East Alabama, our main focus is letting our victims or survivors know that, what's happened to them is not their fault. They are not the one to blame, that we believe them. So we think it's very important to empower them and let them know that what has happened to them does not define them as a person, and that it's just important for them to know, one, what to do when they are in the situation of being sexually assaulted, but it's also to empower them, to let them know that, these things are not going to, they can, in time, there's a healing journey for them in their future, and that it's just important for us just to teach them that and for them to know that, because when something like that happens to them, it is traumatizing, and it's very hard for them to, overcome that sometimes by themselves. And that's why we're here for them. We're their social, we're their support. We're sometimes their only support they have. And so that's why we think it's so important to teach them that. It's just to help them through that journey and be there with them. I hope that answered the question.
And I'm sorry, the question is specifically about why is it important to have sex education, or about assault specifically? Sorry.
No, you're good. We were just curious why, like in your field, like you as a columnist, why is it important for you to talk about sex education?
Well, at least from my perspective, it doesn't exist for LGBT people for the most part. I mean, even if you're fortunate enough to live in a place where, or have a school system where you receive some kind of sex education, there's no sex education basically for gay men and women. So that creates, at least, certainly in my own life and in the lives of so many people that I see, so many problems, because we learn our information through porn or through older people, and that creates a bizarre array of expectations and toxicities that are very prevalent in queer culture because of that, because that information is just not accessible or available, and because porn does create this sort of mythology about what a normal sex life looks like, and it's completely unrealistic. I mean, I'd say that probably the majority of my readers are are gay and queer and trans men, and they go whole lifetimes. I mean, I get questions from 75-year-old men who have never had sex because they've either been terrified of it or nobody ever just taught them how. And so not speaking about sex education harms generations of people and leaves them without the tools to be able to communicate sex adequately and have these conversations.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. Research shows that only about 10% of young people have had comprehensive sex education. And so that's why it's critical for parents, community members to engage in these conversations. Like Alex said, repeatedly, the average age that a person first encounters pornography is 11 years old. And so pretty much their first sexual encounter is through pornography. And that's how they're learning how to engage with people who they're interested in. And so just like Alex said, it creates these unrealistic expectations. And research also links pornography to violence, specifically violence against women, but there really hasn't been, especially for young people, there hasn't been enough research to show what the long-term impact of viewing pornography at a young age is, mostly because it's unethical to show pornography to children, which that should be unethical. So we really don't know, but from my perspective, working with victims of sex trafficking, we talk a lot about what does and to me, sex trafficking, pornography, those are the most unhealthy versions of sex and sexuality that we have. So a lot of times the conversation goes to, well, what does healthy sexuality look like? And I have a lot of parents who ask me, how do I prevent my child from being assaulted? How do I prevent my child from being trafficked? And fortunately, parent engagement is one of the strongest, if not strongest, protective factors for prevention. So that's like number one, yay, parents, you care. Like that's really, really important. But it's also important so that we're having these conversations about healthy sexuality so that we can kind of swing that pendulum back away from those very unhealthy and very dangerous behaviors, sexual behaviors.
With Period, something that I really admire that we're doing is making all of this information available with transparency and honesty. You know, we aren't shying away from what we're including, and we aren't just covering, you know, one small facet of it. We're trying, you know, to gather information on everything so that we can provide the best resources to you all. So that's what I think is the most important, is just being able to bring everyone into the conversation and provide everything we can possible, because it is hard to find those resources and information on your own. You know, Google is so vast, and sometimes it's like, where do I even begin? And so hopefully with what we're doing with Period, Reagan and I, we can provide that starting point for some people.
I'll just say that I agree with, you know, what the three of you have said. There are many myths, you know, circulating concerning our sexual health, and people really need to know, you know, the documented truth and facts. And the way those are revealed a lot of times is through transparency, you know, through people being able to share their stories, share their experiences, and things of that nature. Yeah, we just had a Zoom on Sunday, and there was a young lady, because I partner with some people who are heavily concerned about sex trafficking as well. A young lady told her story. So we have to just keep it at the forefront and help people understand that these things are real. You know, they are real, regardless of, you know, your socioeconomic status or your location or population or what have you. You know, it can happen to anyone, you know. And a lot of times we think that only certain demographics house people who are not being taught proper sex education. Well, I want you to know that thing is broad. It's across the spectrum, you know. So you have some affluent people who are not talking about it, and can't talk about it, what have you. And then, of course, you have the underserved communities where, it's just not talked about. So everybody needs the information. Everybody needs the truth. And it's disheartening to know that in 2020, there are little girls who are starting their cycle right now, and no one has prepared them for that, And so healthy sex education, language, age appropriately, early enough, is needed across the spectrum.
I mean, I certainly agree. I write about HIV/AIDS quite a bit, and for Plus magazine and a few other places. I tested positive at 21, which at the clinic where I did, I was one of the youngest people to ever test positive there. And they told me that my demographic, at the time, they told me that my demographic, I think 18 to 20 something, was the most at risk demographic of contracting HIV, and I think it very well might still be. Which, I mean, this was the South. I'm from Georgia, so where the mention of HIV was taboo because it was associated with gay men, and so I went through an entire college experience, and no one told me about HIV. Nobody told me about it. I didn't know anything about it, and I was a sexually active adult, and not a single adult had sat me down and told me how to have safe sex. The gross irresponsibility of that is just staggering. Because the first thing that somebody says when someone does test positive for HIV is, you were being irresponsible. And that's the stigma, of course, associated with HIV, is that you were being irresponsible, that you weren't, obeying safe sex rules. But in reality, how can you be responsible if no one teaches you how to be responsible?
Yes.
And across the Southeast, that's I'm only recently out of the South, and across the Southeast, I find that is a more prevalent problem. I'm curious if those who are in the South right now see that.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was just going to affirm still about 50% of new HIV cases are from individuals between the ages of 18 to 25 years old.
Yeah.
And additionally, I feel pretty fortunate. I grew up in Atlanta. We did have HIV/AIDS training in our sex education. But traveling around the world, I've learned that either there hasn't been any discussion of HIV/AIDS in particular, or when there is, they're teaching myths rather than teaching science. Mm-hmm. And especially so overseas, no matter what language they speak, they still call it HIV, which doesn't mean anything in their language. Because they just call it HIV, but they don't know what that stands for. And so even with calling it that, it's still kind of mythic proportion, and they don't understand how to contract it. It's commonly believed that you can get it from a toilet seat or from hugging, and those kinds of things. And so, yeah, I think across the board, like Southeast for sure, but globally, we're missing a lot of education about safe sex. And access to contraceptives as well is a major issue in the United States specifically, that isn't the same around the world.
And like you said, Alex, when I was growing up, I mean, I don't remember, because I, thought about it a time or two, and I'm like, no one ever told me anything about anything with sex. I mean, the only thing I ever heard was, you just don't do that till you're married. That was the end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it is very important. And now that, I have children, it is very important, because in reality, we all want to think, oh, our children will never do that. They're too young for that. They would never do that. But I mean, it's so important, because they do need to know, because I mean, it's a part of life. It's a reality that it's, it could happen at any time. And so they do need to be educated. So they do know how to protect themselves and responsibility and all of those things. But I don't remember at all, even growing up through school. I just don't remember ever anyone talking to us about sex or anything.
Yeah, I will say I grew up in Alabama where sex education is not required. And I remember the extent of the sex curriculum I got was basically a crash course on STDs that were used as fear tactics towards us. And it was caught by one of the football coaches. And I remember what he told us was outer course is anything that happens on the outside, inner course is inside. That was the one sentence we got. But then we got all of the movies about the STDs and the videos of the girls calling themselves dirty. And yeah, so, and I'm probably a little bit younger than most of the panelists here. So it's pretty disappointing that this was in the mid 2010s and this was still happening.
That's why I think sex positivity is so important. It's absent from, like, when you do find information about sex, it's rare to encounter an educator and an opinion that says, you know, sex is good. It's great. It's one of the, it's this wonderful thing. Here's how to do it safely. Because generally speaking, most people's idea of a comprehensive safe sex course involves a lot of fear and a lot of shaming and mythologies that certain numbers are safer. And the reality is that shame and moralistic perspectives of sex don't keep anybody safer. If anything, at least certainly what I see, they do the very opposite. So I think sex positivity is incredibly important because a lot of people go into sex responding to the harm and the danger and the negativity of all of it. And I think that what Anna said is really well put.
Yeah, healthy sex education puts you in a position, for lack of a better phrase, to be able to make a choice. You see, when you're educated, you have the information, you have the knowledge, you've got tools, you can make a choice. When you don't know what you don't know, you know? And so whoever is, you know, perhaps leading or, you know, the discussion or the actions or whatever, and then you're struggling, like, should I do this or should I not? Because you just don't know. You know, I have a phrase that I use, you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of times we expect really people to know things that they don't know, and it's just unrealistic expectations. I mean, if you have not imparted it into me, you have not taught me, then how will I know? You know, so I bring that into my practice as well. You don't know what you don't know. And there's so many adults who have experienced trauma. We were talking about that a minute ago, and they have not shared their story. So I encounter men, you know, and women in their 60s and 70s who have never told anyone that someone, you know, molested them or fondled them or had, you know, and so I'm, for the first time, they're in a safe space and they're sharing this with me. So I can't even begin to imagine their whole life. They have tried to have courtships. They've tried to have marriage. They've, you know, and this pain and this guilt, this shame, this misunderstanding has been with them their whole life. And now they are getting an inkling of hope to free themselves because they're sharing it with me right now in their 50s and 60s, you know. So, yeah, healthy sex education is very, very necessary, I believe, age appropriately, early enough. You know, when little people start asking questions, you need to give them answers age appropriately, because that's telling you that their curiosity is up, rather than saying, oh, get out of here, we'll talk about that later, or, you know, I don't want to talk about that. You know, yeah, you need to talk about it because they're curious.
And I think as a parent, it's very important too to tell your children, like Courtney had said earlier on, it's important that the parents are the one educating them and telling them the right things, because if they don't, there's a friend that's going to tell them something the same age or a little older that's going to tell them the wrong information. So you want to make sure that what your child is getting, you know that it's the right information. So when they do have questions, and you want them to feel safe with you and feel safe to come and ask you those questions. That way, whenever they do have a question then, or even in their future, they know, you know what, it's okay to go to them and talk to my mom or talk to my dad or talk to whoever about this situation.
Yeah, so research shows that kids do talk to their friends, their peers about sex. They look at media, they look at social media. Sometimes they go to religious leaders, teachers, mentors to find out information, but still, in all of those cases, parents still carry the number one greatest impact on the developing sexual health of adolescents.
I think something that really stands out about that is like with my personal experience, my mom's very open about everything and has been really transparent like through it all. So is my father, but of course I talk to my mother more about those things. And a big difference that I've noticed is that a lot of my friends feel like they can't turn to their parents. And, you know, in times where something has happened in the middle of sex, instead of calling their mother or their guardian, they call me to talk to my mom. You know, they say, you know, how do you talk to your mom? I don't know what's going on. You know, and my mom tends to be a big person, you know, not just for me, but for my friends about sex and sex health and menstruation issues, just because she's always been open and has always been on the forefront in those conversations with me as well as with my friends. Like if we're watching a movie when we were younger, she would sit us down and talk about certain things. Depending on what the movie was and what the content was, and always made it clear that, you know, that she was a safe space and that was an opportunity. And it just shocks me how many people don't have that relationship whatsoever and don't even have somebody like that in their life to turn to.
Thank you, Emily. That's what I was going to respond to. I don't have the stats, and so I wouldn't dare take a stab at it, but I can guarantee you, you're among a small 10 to 20%, you know, that have that connection. And that's awesome because a lot of parents are still, whether they can't or they just won't, they're not talking to their children about it.
And of course, you know, if you're a queer child and your parents are very conservative or very religious, they're oftentimes are the last people you would go to ask about this kind of information. So I say that the numbers are, I mean, I don't know what they are obviously, but I would imagine that the numbers are likely so much worse for LGBT kids. I mean, how many LGBT kids can go to their parents and say, how do I have this kind of sex? I think that I mean, oftentimes, even when you're at the age where you would be asking your parents, you haven't even figured out that that's the kind of sex that you want. So the issue is more pronounced for the queer community, I would say.
Yeah, so you all brought up a lot of really, really good points, and kind of tangenting off of that to another question, how should families or schools talk or teach about these various subjects? And should they be taught differently based on like your age or your identity or various subpopulations?
So, yeah, I'll go first. Sorry, I keep getting up and leaving. My little neighbors, like they're like 2 7-year-olds, like lost their puppy for a second. And so they were trying to find their puppy. And so they found the puppy. They came to tell me that they found the puppy. So everyone is fine and safe. Sophie is fine. Okay, so yeah, talking about sex, a lot of people don't know how to go about doing it. And so research shows that, first of all, young people need to feel supported. They need to have healthy relationships with their parents, and that can look different for different relationships, but that's the same across the board. Conversations should take place regularly and be age appropriate. And so research kind of shows 3 different time periods when it's critical to have conversations about sex. One would be for girls specifically, but also around the same time for boys, pre-menstruation, to have conversations about bodies and how bodies are going to change. And then there should be another conversation when when kissing maybe starts, hand holding starts, to discuss boundaries, how to say no in a healthy way to sex. And then the third time should be before intercourse, which would be to discuss safe sex, to discuss consent, what does sexual assault look like, and contraceptives. Research shows that about 50% of kids engage in heavy petting or oral sex before they have any conversation about contraceptives. So those are kind of the general times to have them. And also research shows that conversations should be casual and should be kind of ping pong in nature, where the safe adult is saying something and then the young person is saying something, and it kind of goes back and forth. It shows that lecturing, especially harsh lecturing, actually encourages unhealthy sexual behavior, whereas really informal, casual, regular conversations support healthy sexual behaviors. I think that's all I have. Oh, I will say my A, B, C, and D theory. So there's this theory, I didn't come up with it. It's called A, B, C, and D. Came from a researcher named Shalette, but he says all conversations should follow this ABCD conceptual model. A is to discuss autonomy. B is building good romantic relationships. So taking that time to build a relationship with that person before engaging in sexual activity. C is connectedness, and that's regarding with parents and caregivers and safe adults. And then D is recognizing diversity and removing disparities. So acknowledging that not everybody's experience is the same. So A is autonomy, B is building healthy relationships, C is connectedness with caregivers, and D is recognizing diversity and removing disparities.
I'm writing this down. That's very useful. Thank you.
Right? I was like, oh man, this is so good. Unfortunately, the model has not been tested yet. It's kind of just been that's why it's a conceptual model. But I still think it's really good in terms of how to build the content into those conversations.
Do you mind repeating the question again, Reagan?
Yeah, it was kind of a hefty question. So it was, how should families or schools teach or talk about sex or menstruation, and should the conversations be different based on like your age, or should it be different for a school versus a family, or in different subpopulations?
Yeah, so I think there is somewhat, of course, different discussions you have depending on the age, but it is very important to start young. For me and my brother, in elementary school, 1st and 2nd grade is when sex first started being talked about. Sex and sex positions. My brother came home, one of his best friends was asking him, what is this? Like, what's this sex position? My cousin told me that this is what sex is. Can you ask your mom? And so his teacher had to send home a note explaining like, hey, this is what all these kids have been hearing. It's up to you what you want to tell your child. But I think that, at such a young age, there are different things that we can define and start talking about. And I think something that is important to push early on is a lot about consent, and what consent looks like, as well as gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. Because as you go on in sex education, I had a pretty extensive sex education in my middle school. It was more so geared towards the norm that exists, towards just heterosexual sex as being the default. And the fact of the matter is, like, I know a big chunk of my friends in that room may not have wanted to just be hearing that. And that is something that was a missed opportunity when you're giving us so much information and you're being so extensive and upfront. We need to develop information that applies to everyone, because it's happening, and that's okay, and that is life, and you need to provide that information for everyone. And then I think also STD and STI testing should be pushed a lot better. To me, how I've seen it with not only friends but in my personal encounters is that getting STD and STI testing is kind of dirty. It's like, you know, I haven't been safe. I need to get tested, and not more so like a preventative measure just to check and see your wellness and your well-being. And so I think working against that stigma that I've noticed for some, and just like having to even defend doing it. I've had encounters where people have defended that, like, oh, like I've only been with 1 or 2 people in the past year. Like, why are you asking me about this? When truly it's just about being safe. And I think that's a big thing that is missed a lot. That consent, and then also that pleasure. I think that is something that would come at a later on age, but what pleasure is and how that can look for a bunch of different people. You know, they're providing us the information and facts about, okay, this is what sex is. You know, these are the things that can happen from sex. Here are things to prevent these things. But what about, you know, what sits at the center of it? You know, how are we supposed to have positive sex experiences if we aren't explained how to do that? And I think having those conversations, you know, and even trying to figure out how to approach those from an education standpoint is a little hard to figure out. But I think it's important, and that's the big next step we can take to greatly improve the sex health and the sex positivity we each experience.
So Emily kind of touched on this in her question, but do you guys think that adding in consent in like healthy relationships would be beneficial and aid with sex education?
100%.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And consent is something that, you know, it's a buzzy word. I mean, especially in media right now, everyone's writing about consent or talking about consent. And there's a reason for that, because, I mean, even 6 years ago, you didn't see all these articles in Vice and everywhere else about consent. And so, and I mean, that's because of the Me Too movement. That's because of this social moment we're all experiencing where consent is suddenly taking this, it's in the floor of our national conversations. And our understanding of it is evolving right now. Like we are currently understanding how to talk about consent, because in many ways it is sort of a new topic that a lot of people are finally exploring. I've had to look back on gay male culture and say that, you know, as comfortable as I am with it, the reality is that there's a lot of disrespected consent in the stereotypical gay bar. And that's a difficult thing to say to someone who has 40 years in this culture, that we have to start talking about consent. And so I'm fascinated to see how the model of consent is currently changing. I mean, like just the way you teach consent. Is it enthusiastic consent? You know, I mean, does enthusiastic consent? A conversation that I think is really important is, does enthusiastic consent apply in all situations? And does everyone interpret enthusiastic consent the same? I mean, it's a challenge for sex educators because there's no unanimous, I mean, even legally in legal definitions, there's no unanimous global legal definition of consent. It changes from country to country. I mean, even in the US from state to state. So I don't know. How do, I mean, you are sex educators. How do you define consent in your respective practices?
Consent is, you know, clear, coherent, willing, ongoing. There's never any confusion about, you know, is it a yes? Sometimes that yes may look different than an actual verbal yes, but consent is where the other person is they understand that's what they mean. That's, you know, because we even learn from like an early age. I know this has been said before, like when we're growing up, you know, you go over and you see your family members, or you'll go to a friend and you'll say, oh, you know, go give them a hug. And you have them going, no, I don't want to hug them. No, I don't want to hug them. And, you know, years ago, we were like, oh, just go hug them. But now we need to teach them, even at an early age, it's okay, to not want to hug them. And it's very important for that other person to know to ask, is it okay if I hug you? I worked in preschool for 14 years. And so that was a big thing, is just even asking when a child is crying and upset. It is so important. Even, you want to just go up and hug them, but it's so important to ask them, is it okay if I hug you? And just doing simple steps like that at an early age can make an impact, I feel like, even for their future.
Yeah, and even practicing that with trauma victims is also good. So for people who have had their boundaries crossed, to start saying, is it okay if I touch your shoulder? Is it okay if I hold your hand? That is a new paradigm for them and can actually bring a lot of healing, so that they can, especially for people whose physical boundaries have been crossed at early ages, it can start to kind of rebuild those personal boundaries.
And I'm going to brag on our organization just a little bit, because I do feel like we have been able to slyly slide in consent education to our safe dating program. It's not comprehensive sex ed, but we're able to have a couple of slides in there that do talk about consent. And our prevention educator actually is on here tonight, but we make an effort to go in and talk about consent. And she uses the acronym EASY, which is enthusiastic, able to be retracted, sober, and capital YES, yes. So that's kind of how we've been able to, like, we're still working. I'm kind of shocked that we've been able to and not really had like people question it, but even the high schoolers we have talked to, a lot of them will tell us that they have also heard acronyms. I don't remember what they were, but it is good to hear that it seems to be starting the conversations in the high schools.
I think what we were in a panel, when was that, Reagan? Like a month ago, where we talked about why does it feel like this generation of men are pushing boundaries more than previous generations? And there's no data to show that that's the case. Just maybe we have more information now. I'm not sure. We're talking about it more. But one thing that's fighting against this thing of consent is pornography, because what that repeatedly shows is that consent is not required, and it also shows that sex isn't mutually pleasurable either. And so when you have one narrative over here, and then we have another Me Too consent narrative here, those are the things that are kind of butting heads with each other, and why it's critical that we do have more conversations about consent, because unfortunately pornography is infiltrating media, is infiltrating culture at an extremely fast rate.
I think what's so important, I mean, I tell everybody I'm pro porn. I mean, I have experience in the industry, but just the cultural harm of porn can't, be downplayed. You're completely right. It gives people a guidebook when in reality it's fantasy. But if someone is young and doesn't know that it's fantasy, they take it as truth. And I think that one way to work around that is to talk about porn, because it's not going to go away. It's a part of our culture. It employs, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and only increasing now. So it's never going to vanish, and there's no way to effectively protect somebody from it. So now porn must be included in safe sex education, because without mentioning it, it gives people unintentionally, even by most performers, it gives young viewers a guidebook for how to have sex. And it can't be seen that way. It must be seen as fantasy. It must be seen as entertainment. And one thing that gives me a little bit of hope is that, just in the network, in the world of performers and entertainers that I'm personally connected with, there's a lot of self-aware not necessarily studios, but self-aware models and performers who are actually taking ownership of the fact that porn has caused immense damage and has created and fostered and has its place in rape culture. And there's actually a push right now among adult entertainers and people in the sex positive industry to change that and to provide a new narrative. You're starting to see more experimental porn where narratives are healing and where there is discussion on consent. And I think that it's sort of beautiful to see it changing from the inside out. I don't think it's happening fast enough, and I don't know where that's going to go. But an anti-porn stance is invariably harmful because it just ignores the reality that porn's always going to be here. And I think it has to be talked about pretty early, because the questions that I get from people about very extreme hardcore porn are, I'm not that old. I'm incredibly young, and the age of people asking me about porn that they've seen shocks me. So kids are getting porn incredibly young, and with emerging technology, that's not going to slow down. It can't be contained.
Yeah, but I've done some informal. We talk about how do you educate on sex and stuff. One of the things I've done is done an informal poll to see how old kids were the first time they saw a pornographic image, and I define what a pornographic image is for the kids, and I have them write down on a note card just an age, and then they pass it in. And I've done this with hundreds of young people, middle school and high schoolers. And repeatedly, the average age has been 11 years old. But I've seen it as young as 2 years old. And for the 2-year-old one that we had, the person wrote that they saw it in a video game the first time. And so that's another thing that we didn't even think about. Like, oh my gosh, like thinking about and having a discussion about video games and how women and violence against women is portrayed in video games is another conversation that needs to be had.
And I think that no matter, I have children, I have teenage boys, but I think even when you're just sitting on your phone, because everybody's got their phones, you've got ads popping up. They're going to find you some way, somehow. And that's probably the biggest thing too, is sometimes you can't even avoid it coming up on your phone. You can be watching TV and it's going to pop up. I know one time, my kids used to play, with my phone all the time before they had their own phones, and they'd play these different kinds of video games or little games on there. And then one day I had my phone and I was like, oh my goodness. And there was these ads popping up, and it was hardcore. And I couldn't get it off my phone. I was sitting there trying to hit all the buttons, and I was like, it won't go off. And so I literally had to take it to, the phone company. And I was like, what do I do with this? I cannot get it off my phone. And it really scares me, because it makes me wonder now, with so many people getting, cell phones and all these things and technology so young, we don't really know, even if you're monitoring it very closely, it still can pop up. It can still be seen. And, a lot of us as parents feel like, oh, we're protected because we have all these filters on the phones. Well, their friends may not have filters. And so they're going to find a way, or it's going to find a way to find them. So it is so important, because it's there. And like y'all said, it's not going away. It's only, I think, actually getting maybe even worse with advertisements.
I think also media consumption plays a big role in that. I remembered a really big difference of this in my middle school and high school, where quite literally, AirDrop first started, and, there's this very graphic nude image of a person that it was just a funny thing to airdrop that to a random person in the cafeteria. Or, there are some videos, and we may all have ideas in our mind of what those videos for us were when we were in school that were trending. It was like, oh, have you seen that video? You haven't? Let me show it to you. And all of those things very much so push into a realm where, without proper education on sex and sex health and what that should look like, could be quite confusing and, create a certain narrative. I also remember when Snapchat came out, I was in middle school, and that pushed a wave of sending nude images to each other. And that was something that, never was talked about, because people got in trouble with school and got expelled and kicked out and sent to like the, these kids did something really bad type of little school thing you had to go to. And then it was never correctly explained to us of, okay, like this is why maybe doing this at your age with strangers on the internet is bad. It might not be the healthiest thing. These are the things you need to keep in mind when you're engaging in those activities. Those things weren't explained. It was just, yeah, no. And that's not enough. Kids are going to be curious and do what they want regardless. And without having those conversations in a way that isn't like, okay, you're bad for doing that, I think it just doesn't explain it to somebody in a way that's proper and makes you really question, is this actually what I should be doing? Or, is this safe to be doing? And of course, the answer to that question changes greatly depending on your age, what's legal, what's not legal, and all of that. But I think it has to be a very opening and accepting and welcoming environment for any conversation, but to understand that. And I think consent gets really blurred when it comes to nude images and partial nudes. There are times where people might just screenshot and you did not anticipate that. What do you do then? How can you ensure that person's going to delete that image of you? And then we also have revenge pornography on the outturn of that, where, I had friends in high school go through that, where they broke up with a guy and he made an Instagram account of all of her pictures. And it was like real quick, okay, hey guys, like close group of friends, you guys need to go on and block this account constantly on Instagram until it gets deleted. And it comes down to like, how do you even approach that with the police? It's such a big, extensive thing that it is never approached. That's one of the things that I think, it's a little awkward to have to approach in an education standpoint, but I think it should happen. And I think it's hard to be oblivious to the fact that like people do send nude images and that people even get sent unwanted nude images, which is just, there's so much that we can improve on how we discuss those things.
And I think also too, I know our music over time has changed too. So even when you're driving down the road, you can hear songs, that are playing that, I feel like the radio stations and stuff like that have changed because over time, I remember, a lot of things were like bleeped out or not there, but now they put a lot more stuff on the radio for you to hear. So I think that's also, sometimes, like as a parent, that's something that you could use as a teachable moment when you're in the car and you're listening to a song and you hear some things, you're like, okay, let's talk about that. Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Sure.
I just want to respond to what Emily said because I thought it was so fantastic. Porn is a word we use to define a certain kind of media. And I'm not even necessarily convinced that future generations will even have this distinction. I think the distinction, especially today, is almost arbitrary because, porn is funny. It's a meme. It's a joke that goes around, from your friends. Like, it's not even consumed erotically. It's just, I think that the boundary that older generations create between what is porn and what is the rest of safe consumable media, I'm not even sure it really exists anymore. I think that like the minute someone starts consuming digital content, it's safe to assume that porn is going to exist, and so and will find a way to them. I don't necessarily think that that's a problem, just because porn is generally a negative term, and so speaking about porn and access to porn and who sees porn and how young people see porn, I think we might not even be engaging in a kind of myth talk, because, you know, I think the future generations may not even make the distinction. They may not even have that distinction, because it infiltrates so much of content anyway. It's in video games, it's in movies. And when you see a love scene in a movie, is that porn? You know, then you get into the debate of like, what is porn and what isn't, and that gets tricky. I think that with competent sexual education, the need to distinguish what is not to be viewed and what is becomes a little needless. Like if you provide someone at a young age to say, okay, this is what you're going to encounter, this is competent sex information, assuming that they're going to encounter it, then is porn this threat anymore? Because I don't think it's ever going to. I don't think that a modern day parent necessarily has the ability to determine whether or not their child can access porn. I just don't even think that ability even exists anymore.
So we are nearing the end of our hour, but I just wanted to give the panelists a moment to say anything else that they would like to about sex education and menstrual education. And if there's not like a last minute thing that you'd like to say, if there's anything that you wish that you had known when you were growing up, whether or not you had access to education or not.
I would like to say that I think consent is incredibly important, and we need to work to define, you know, what giving consent is, because I've been in several encounters where, you know, I've gone to my friends afterwards and been like, wow, that's like the most, he was so respectful. You know, he asked me what, you know, if I was okay, checked on me throughout our experience. And like, I deemed him better for that, when truthfully, like that should be the standard, you know, that is how it should go, you know. And on the opposite end of that, there's times where, you know, a guy's just shoved his hand down my pants, and it's like, how to navigate what consent means and how to give that throughout an experience, and also how to withdraw consent. You know, having to stop an encounter and having to end something is incredibly difficult, you know, without lying, without saying, oh, I'm sick, I can't, you know, and coming up with an excuse as to why. There's no reason to make an excuse. It should be able to be an open thing to say, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. And, you know, I felt uncomfortable being able to say that. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who felt uncomfortable being able to do the same thing. So working to do that, I think, is incredibly important. And also how to set those boundaries and define those boundaries with the person. You know, I think it comes down to the standard of how we discuss those things from the get-go, from an early age, and what we are taught, how that will further impact us down the line when we actually are sexually active at whatever point in our life that comes. And something that I also wish I knew growing up is that sex can be painful, and sex can look different for everyone else. You know, most people think, okay, like penetration at first, you know, it's going to be okay, but it may not. Like, sex will look different for so many people, and not having an understanding of how to make positive experiences, you know, I think there are ways to have positive sex experiences without having to do certain things. And there are ways to define that for yourself personally of what is best for yourself. And I don't think it was ever taught enough or even approached that, like, the traditional idea of penetration may be something that some people may not be able to do. And so then when you reach that point where you figure out you can't maybe do that, you feel, you know, less than potentially, or like, what's wrong with you? And there's nothing wrong with you. But I think it's very important to just define what sex positivity is, how to have positive experiences, how to engage in pleasurable experiences across the gambit, you know, across the board for everyone, so that it can be a safe space, and so that there's not like one definitive idea in your head of what that looks like.
I put a link to the article that talks about the A, B, C, and D conceptual model. Hopefully you'll be able to access it from there. but that's the original source that comes from. I think the closing remark that I have is that this is your responsibility to be having these conversations with your peers and your network. Not everybody is going to have access to an Amanda or an Alex or a Dr. Mildred or Reagan to have these conversations. It's going to be you. And we are humans. And so we have relationships and we have sex, and there's no way around it. And so it's your responsibility, especially the men who are here, to be having these conversations with their peers about consent and about healthy sexual behavior.
I just want to say thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this. I really enjoyed it. And my closing remarks would be healthy sex education is just as important as our mental health education. You know, our medical and our physical health education is just as important. That's where the holistic, gamuts of it come together. You've got to cover all of it. If you're unhealthy in one area, you're gonna be unhealthy in other areas. Okay, so that's my little capsule. It's just as important as the medical, the mental health, and your physical health.
Closing remark would just be, I love what everybody has said, and thank y'all so much for having me on today. That, consent is so very, very important. And, if there's people out there, parents, victims, survivors, anybody out there that they, they don't feel comfortable or they don't know how to go about it, that there are people, there are resources, there are agencies out there that can help you. We are out here for you guys. And we, that's what our job is. That's what we want to do. And we want to help you. And so just know that there are lots of people out there that can support you when maybe the people that are closest to you, you don't feel as comfortable. There are safe havens out there with other people and agencies.
I guess my closing remarks, just because I love everything that Emily has said, is, I get messages sometimes from gay men who for whatever reason either can't have penetrative sex or they don't enjoy penetrative sex, and they see an absurd emphasis on penetrative sex as the only kind of sex they can have. And that penetrative sex is core to the gay identity. And they feel incredibly shut out from their community and from that experience. And I always want to stress that that's one way to have sex. And if your definition of sex is penetration, then you have a really small, limited, stifled definition of sex that is incredibly ableist and incredibly normative and that harms everybody. So I guess if there's one thing that I wish I had been told was that sex is really whatever you make it. There's no single definition of sex. That's why I have such issue with virginity myths, because you define when you're no longer a virgin. There's no working definition of sex, and so there's no working definition of losing it. Intimacy can be sex. I mean, you can have a sexual engagement with erotic media. You can have, mental stimulation and romantic stimulation with somebody else can be sex. Sex never has to include penetration, and that whatever sexual identity you own is powerful and affirming. And I wish that more young people, and especially more queer people, were told that sex is that everyone can participate in it, that all bodies are welcome in sex, that all abilities are welcome in sex, and that this very narrow definition we've operated under for so many years, that what is sex is only one item on a very long buffet table of erotic experience, and that a better sex life, I would say, involves exploring beyond that. So that's what I wish I was told, and that's what I would like to tell young people exploring sex for the first time. And I would also tell them that sex has, talking about both the traditional penetrative sex and all other kinds of sex, that sex has a learning curve, and that the first time might suck, and that's okay. You know, I think that sex is messy and complicated, and we do talk about pleasurable experiences. We also don't talk about lackluster sex, because the reality is a lot of sex, especially during your explorative years, will be lackluster, and that's okay. You know, there's bad sex and good sex, and sometimes you have a good night and sometimes you don't, and it's okay to not perform the way that you see these people perform in this crazy hot video, because they're professionals and you're a real person and you're allowed to have sex like a real person. So that's it.
And I'll also point out that they're acting.
And they're acting. They're acting. And I mean, I've literally directed porn. So I've seen the messes and the mistakes and the bad footage that get edited out. Porn is total fantasy. I've seen people not be completely ready and have to stop. And you never see that in the final cut. So I just want to tell everybody that whatever you think is porn, the reality is if you're watching a 20-minute video, that's a 2 or 3 hour long session between models who hung out 30, 45 minutes beforehand, and you don't see all the mistakes and errors that happen in real sex. And I think that's a shame, because I would love to see porn that does show like a misstart or a failed, like, yeah, that sucked, you know, because that would tell somebody looking at porn for the first time that happens. So that's it.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. I will say, I feel like I learned a lot tonight, just by being here and listening to all of your ideas and opinions. We want to open up the floor now to anyone who may have questions or comments or anything. So any audience members, you can either just like unmute yourselves and ask, or you can either send me or Reagan a chat and we can ask it for you. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, obviously we're always available. And I just want to say really quickly for anyone who may be listening, at Rape Counselors, we do have a 24/7 hotline for victims of sexual assault. So if you are a victim or you have a friend who is a victim, we just want you guys to know that that resource is always available to you. And Amanda, would you mind just throwing that in the chat box real quick while we close up? Thank you.
All right, awesome. Well, since we don't have any other questions, just once again want to thank all of the panelists for joining us and everyone else that was able to Zoom in. This was a really, really awesome discussion, and I'm so grateful that you guys were able to participate. And with that being said, I hope everyone has a great Tuesday night and look forward to hopefully having more discussions like this in the future.